In the decades following the Second World War, U.S. defense planners confronted a structural constraint that would shape global force projection doctrine for the remainder of the Cold War. The time required to move heavy equipment across oceans consistently exceeded the time required to move personnel, and in any crisis demanding rapid reinforcement of Europe, the Middle East, or Northeast Asia, sea-lift transit measured in weeks threatened to outrun political decision windows measured in days, creating a strategic vulnerability in which U.S. forces could arrive by air but remain combat ineffective while awaiting tanks, artillery, vehicles, ammunition, and sustainment stocks still at sea. And throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the dominant reinforcement model relied on traditional sea-lift departure from continental U.S. ports after mobilization orders were issued, meaning that equipment remained stateside until crisis activation. And while this approach was sufficient for deliberate escalation scenarios, war planning assumptions increasingly incorporated the possibility of compressed warning time, particularly in Europe, where Warsaw Pact offensive doctrine emphasized rapid concentration, and therefore the U.S. military began exploring structural alternatives that would decouple equipment transit time from crisis onset, leading to the conceptual foundation of maritime prepositioning, in which heavy materiel would be stored afloat in forward theaters during peacetime, reducing deployment timelines by eliminating transoceanic transit from the continental United States during initial response. And early experimentation with afloat prepositioning occurred in the 1960s under various logistics initiatives that sought to maintain selected stocks closer to likely theaters of operation without permanently stationing large land forces ashore. And these experiments were shaped by operational lessons from Korea and Vietnam, where sea-lift bottlenecks, port congestion, and extended equipment transit had exposed the friction inherent in traditional mobilization models, and by the late 1960s, planners within the Department of Defense and the Military Sea Transportation Service, later Military Sea-Lift Command, began studying whether modified cargo vessels could be configured to store complete unit equipment sets in ready-to-unload condition, thereby transforming sea-lift from a reactive movement instrument into a forward-position deployment multiplier, and the core operational logic was straightforward but transformative. If heavy equipment were already afloat within operational distance of a crisis zone, then airlift could deliver personnel directly to a designated reception airfield, where they would marry up with prepositioned gear within days rather than weeks, compressing the timeline from political authorization to combat-ready status, and altering adversary calculations about U.S. responsiveness. And throughout the 1970s, this concept evolved through iterative planning studies, logistics simulations, and small-scale afloat storage initiatives, particularly in regions where basing rights were politically constrained and permanent ground presence was diplomatically sensitive, and the strategic impetus intensified after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, which exposed both the speed of regional conflict escalation and the logistical strain of transoceanic reinforcement, prompting renewed focus on reducing deployment lag. And analytical modeling conducted in the mid-1970s demonstrated that conventional sea lift from East Coast ports to the Indian Ocean could require multiple weeks depending on convoy speed and port clearance, whereas pre-positioned vessels stationed in theater could deliver equipment within a fraction of that time, fundamentally shifting the deployment curve. And this recognition led to expanded planning for afloat pre-positioned stocks that would later culminate in the formalization of maritime prepositioning ship squadrons. But before that institutional consolidation occurred, the conceptual evolution during the 1970s laid the doctrinal and logistical groundwork for a new paradigm in U.S. force projection, in which maritime prepositioning was understood not as supplementary sea lift, but as a structural mechanism to alter Cold War deployment timelines, by integrating forward storage, airlift synchronization, and rapid offload capability into a cohesive operational framework calibrated against the compressed warning scenarios that increasingly defined superpower confrontation. During the late 1970s, the strategic shock of regional instability combined with global basing uncertainty accelerated U.S. experimentation with afloat prepositioning, particularly as planners recognized that reliance on fixed overseas depots was politically fragile and potentially vulnerable to sabotage or rapid denial in crisis. And therefore, maritime prepositioning offered a hybrid solution that preserved forward presence without permanent land basing, while also introducing operational flexibility in positioning equipment sets closer to likely theaters such as the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and the Western Pacific. And analytical models conducted by the Joint Staff and the Navy examined the deployment curve of a marine amphibious brigade under three conditions: traditional sea lift departure from continental U.S. ports after activation, forward land-based preposition depots in Allied territory, and afloat prepositioned cargo vessels stationed within operational sailing distance of the crisis zone. And the modeling demonstrated that traditional sea lift required vessel activation, loading at port, ocean transit, often exceeding 20 to 30 days depending on destination, and subsequent offload operations, whereas prepositioned ships could reduce total equipment arrival time to a matter of days once personnel were airlifted to theater, because the heavy materiel was already within proximity, and the critical metric became the marriage-up interval, defined as the time between personnel arrival at reception airfields and full equipment issue from prepositioned ships. And logistics planners began designing vessel configurations to minimize internal cargo rehandling, arranging tanks, vehicles, artillery, and support equipment in sequence optimized for rapid discharge using roll-on, roll-off ramps or heavy lift cranes, thereby reducing port dwell time and accelerating combat readiness. And this required careful engineering of cargo holds to preserve equipment in operational condition during extended afloat storage, including climate control considerations, corrosion prevention measures, and periodic maintenance rotations conducted at sea or in secure anchorages. And because these vessels were not conventional amphibious assault ships, but rather modified commercial cargo platforms under military sea lift command control, planners had to reconcile civilian crew models with military cargo security requirements, embedding onboard support teams capable of safeguarding sensitive materiel while maintaining readiness standards over months of stationing, and geographic positioning doctrine also evolved, with planners calculating optimal station areas that balanced proximity to potential crisis zones with survivability and diplomatic considerations, often choosing international waters within reach of strategic choke points, such as the Suez Canal or Strait of Hormuz. And these positioning decisions were tied directly to deployment timelines measured in days from crisis notification to offload commencement, reflecting a shift in Cold War planning in which maritime prepositioning was increasingly viewed as a timeline compression mechanism capable of altering adversary expectations by reducing the lag between political decision and credible force presence. As the concept matured in the late 1970s and early 1980s, planners began shifting from theoretical modeling to more structured implementation experiments, particularly within the Marine Corps, which required rapid expeditionary capability without the permanent basing footprint of Army heavy divisions. And this institutional demand drove refinement of afloat prepositioning as a brigade equipment package concept, in which an entire Marine Air-Ground Task Force equipment set could be configured, stored, and maintained aboard a small number of dedicated vessels. And the operational benchmark became the ability to airlift personnel from the continental United States to a designated airfield in a crisis region within 48 to 96 hours. then complete equipment offload and combat configuration within an additional defined window, measured in days rather than weeks. And this required precise cargo configuration planning down to pallet sequencing, ensuring that essential items such as command vehicles, communications shelters, engineering assets, fuel systems, and ammunition handling equipment were accessible early in the discharge process rather than buried beneath less time-sensitive cargo. And sealift engineers redesigned internal deck layouts to allow vehicle flow through holds without complex crane sequencing, favoring roll-on, roll-off capability wherever possible to reduce dependency on port infrastructure. And port infrastructure analysis became a parallel planning track, as deployment modeling showed that timeline compression achieved by forward-afloat storage could be undermined if suitable port facilities were unavailable in theater. And therefore, the concept incorporated selective offload flexibility, including the ability to discharge at austere ports with minimal fixed infrastructure, using organic shipboard cranes and lighterage where required. And survivability considerations were integrated into stationing doctrine, recognizing that prepositioned ships concentrated significant combat power in relatively small floating nodes, prompting planners to distribute vessels geographically rather than cluster them in single anchorages, thereby reducing vulnerability to sabotage or sudden interdiction. And maintenance doctrine evolved to ensure that equipment stored for extended periods remained fully mission capable, incorporating scheduled inspection cycles, onboard maintenance detachments, and periodic rotation of high-wear components. And by the early 1980s, these iterative refinements had transformed maritime prepositioning from an experimental logistics hedge into a structured deployment architecture that directly altered Cold War response modeling. As time-phased force deployment data increasingly incorporated prepositioned equipment availability into initial response scenarios, reducing estimated days to combat power, and reshaping calculations of deterrence credibility in regions where permanent basing remained politically constrained. The strategic logic of maritime prepositioning deepened further in the early 1980s as U.S. global planning began to account for simultaneous regional contingencies rather than a single theater escalation. And this multi-directional posture amplified the importance of timeline compression because traditional sealift assets could not be in two oceans at once, and therefore forward-stationed, prepositioned ships provided geographic elasticity that conventional deployment models lacked, allowing equipment sets to be held within operational reach of likely crisis zones without requiring immediate transoceanic transit from U.S. ports. And planners quantified this advantage by comparing sailing days from East Coast embarkation points to the Indian Ocean, which could exceed 3 weeks depending on routing and canal access, against stationing within the Arabian Sea where offload could commence within days of political authorization. And this compression altered operational sequencing by allowing personnel airlift to become the pacing variable rather than sealift, effectively reversing the historical constraint in which heavy equipment arrival defined readiness, and time-phase deployment planning documents began to incorporate prepositioned equipment availability curves, plotting days from decision to full brigade combat capability with and without afloat stocks. And these models demonstrated that maritime prepositioning could reduce deployment timelines by more than half in certain scenarios, particularly where sealift transit previously represented the dominant delay factor. And this quantitative improvement had strategic implications beyond mere speed, as it enabled planners to consider graduated response options that would have been infeasible under traditional deployment models, because forces could be inserted rapidly enough to influence early escalation dynamics rather than arriving after a conflict had already consolidated, and engineering refinements continued in parallel, with vessel modifications emphasizing redundancy and cargo access points, strengthened internal ramps to support tracked vehicle movement, and enhanced ventilation systems to preserve equipment integrity during extended afloat storage in high-temperature maritime environments. And coordination with military sealift command matured into a standing operational framework in which ship readiness status, stationing patterns, and cargo configuration were continuously monitored and periodically exercised, ensuring that prepositioned ships were not symbolic assets, but maintained at readiness levels compatible with rapid activation. And by the mid-1980s, this convergence of operational modeling, engineering adaptation, and institutional integration had embedded maritime prepositioning into Cold War force projection doctrine as a structural mechanism for reshaping deployment timelines, reducing strategic latency, and increasing the credibility of rapid expeditionary response in regions where traditional basing and sealift models impose prohibitive delay. As maritime prepositioning matured, during the mid-1980s, its impact began to be measured not only in theoretical deployment days saved, but in structured readiness metrics tied to specific force packages, and planners increasingly defined the concept in terms of complete unit equipment sets stored afloat rather than generalized cargo tonnage, because the decisive variable was not total volume, but the ability to field a coherent, self-sustaining combat formation upon arrival of personnel, and therefore load planning shifted toward brigade-equivalent packages that included tanks, amphibious assault vehicles, artillery, tactical trucks, engineering assets, bulk fuel systems, ammunition stocks, medical facilities, and maintenance shelters configured in a sequence aligned with operational assembly, and internal ship design was refined to support this sequencing, with deck layouts engineered to allow rapid roll-off of priority vehicles and minimal cargo rehandling, reducing offload time measured in hours per vehicle and total, discharge time measured in days for a full equipment set, and time-phased force deployment models began incorporating defined benchmarks such as personnel airlift completion within 72 hours and equipment offload within 5 to 7 days of arrival at port, creating measurable readiness targets that could be exercised and validated. And survivability doctrine evolved alongside capacity expansion as planners assessed the vulnerability of prepositioned ships to naval interdiction or sabotage and adopted dispersed stationing patterns, rotational movement between anchorages, and operational security measures to reduce detectability while preserving geographic proximity to likely theaters, and maintenance cycles were institutionalized, with onboard support teams conducting preventive inspections and rotating critical components to prevent degradation during extended afloat storage, ensuring that equipment readiness percentages remained high despite months of stationing. And interoperability planning integrated maritime prepositioning into joint and combined exercises, rehearsing airlift marriage procedures at designated reception airfields, and validating port clearance rates under simulated surge conditions. And these exercises revealed that the compression of sealift transit time shifted operational emphasis to coordination between airlift and port operations, making synchronization rather than transit distance the new pacing factor. And by embedding maritime prepositioning into readiness reporting, budgeting, and joint planning documents, the Department of Defense formalized the concept as a standing deployment instrument that fundamentally altered Cold War response timelines by decoupling heavy equipment positioning from crisis onset and integrating forward afloat storage into the architecture of global force projection. The strategic implications of maritime prepositioning became particularly pronounced in contingency planning for Southwest Asia, where the absence of permanent heavy U.S. ground forces and the long sailing distance from continental embarkation ports had historically imposed deployment delays measured in weeks. And by positioning equipment sets afloat within operational reach of the Arabian Sea and adjacent waters, planners recalculated reinforcement curves for a Marine brigade-sized force and found that the interval between presidential authorization and credible ground combat capability could be reduced dramatically, with personnel airlift remaining the primary variable while equipment offload was constrained only by port access and discharge rate rather than transoceanic transit. And these revised timelines were incorporated into joint operational planning documents that projected phased arrival of combat power, plotting day-by-day readiness growth under both traditional sea lift and prepositioned models. And the difference was not marginal, but structural, as the elimination of long-haul ocean transit removed the largest single-time block in the deployment sequence, compressing the overall response arc and altering deterrence calculations in regions where rapid escalation had previously outpaced U.S. reinforcement capability, and engineering refinements continued to optimize discharge efficiency, including reinforcement of internal ramps to accommodate heavier tracked vehicles, installation of improved cargo securing systems to minimize pre-offload preparation time, and configuration of containerized support modules that could be craned ashore in defined sequence without extensive sorting. And port analysis became increasingly granular, identifying specific facilities capable of supporting roll-on, roll-off operations and calculating throughput rates in vehicles per hour and tonnage per crane cycle to ensure that maritime prepositioning advantages were not negated by bottlenecks at the dock. And integration with airlift planning intensified as reception, staging, onward movement, and integration procedures were rehearsed to synchronize arriving personnel with equipment availability, ensuring that units could achieve operational status within compressed windows defined in deployment doctrine. And as this architecture solidified in the latter half of the 1980s, maritime prepositioning was no longer viewed as an experimental augmentation, but as a structural transformation in Cold War deployment planning, one that shifted the temporal center of gravity from sea lift transit duration to synchronization efficiency, and thereby redefine the speed at which the United States could project heavy combat power into distant theaters without permanent basing. As the concept advanced toward formal institutionalization in the late 1980s, the operational architecture surrounding maritime prepositioning became increasingly systematized, with defined readiness reporting categories, standardized cargo configurations, and standing deployment playbooks that linked afloat equipment sets directly to specific units in the continental United States, eliminating ambiguity over which formation would marry up with which vessel package. And this pairing reduced administrative latency during crisis activation because personnel assignment, equipment familiarity, and maintenance documentation were pre-aligned, shortening the interval between airlift arrival and full combat configuration. And planners refined what became known as selective offload sequencing, in which command and control vehicles, communication shelters, engineer assets, and fuel distribution systems were discharged first to establish operational support ashore, before heavy maneuver elements rolled off, thereby smoothing the transition from shipboard storage to land-based combat posture and reducing idle time for arriving personnel. And deployment modeling incorporated these sequencing efficiencies into day-by-day readiness curves, projecting that a brigade-equivalent force could achieve initial operational capability within a matter of days after personnel arrival, with full combat capability following within a compressed window compared to traditional sea lift models, and geographic dispersion doctrine matured as well, with prepositioned ships assigned to patrol patterns or anchorages that balanced proximity to likely crisis zones with survivability considerations, avoiding predictable clustering while remaining within sailing distance measured in days rather than weeks. And maintenance sustainment cycles were integrated into rotational planning so that vessels could periodically enter secure ports for inspection and replenishment without degrading overall theater coverage. And joint exercises rehearsed the entire sequence from airlift embarkation in the United States to port clearance overseas, measuring not only transit time, but coordination efficiency between military sealift command, air mobility assets, and supported ground forces. And these rehearsals validated that the elimination of long-haul sealift as the pacing variable fundamentally restructured Cold War deployment timelines, transforming what had once been a multi-week reinforcement process into a rapid response model calibrated against compressed warning scenarios. And by the eve of formal maritime prepositioning ship squadron establishment, the conceptual evolution of afloat prepositioning had already reshaped U.S. force projection doctrine, embedding forward maritime storage as a core mechanism for altering strategic response speed during the final phase of superpower confrontation. By the end of the 1980s, maritime prepositioning had moved beyond experimental logistics innovation and into the core calculus of deterrence modeling, because planners could now present quantified deployment timelines to civilian leadership, showing the difference between legacy sealift-driven response curves and the compressed arcs enabled by forward-afloat equipment sets. And these comparisons were expressed in days to initial operational capability and days to full brigade combat power metrics, clearly illustrating that the most time-consuming segment of the traditional deployment sequence had been structurally removed. And this transformation altered how war games and crisis simulations were constructed, as scenarios that once assumed adversaries could exploit multi-week reinforcement delays now had to account for rapid insertion of heavy U.S. ground forces supported by prepositioned materiel, and the logistical planning community refined sustainment calculations to ensure that not only initial combat equipment, but also sufficient ammunition, fuel, and maintenance stocks were included aboard prepositioned vessels to support defined periods of independent operation, often measured in days of supply sufficient to bridge the gap until follow-on sealift could arrive. And vessel configuration standards were codified to preserve equipment integrity during prolonged maritime storage in varying climates, incorporating corrosion control systems, climate stabilization where required, and maintenance inspection cycles scheduled to maintain high readiness percentages across all major end items, and coordination mechanisms between military sealift command and supported units were institutionalized through documentation that detailed cargo layout diagrams, offload sequencing charts, and reception procedures at designated ports, reducing friction during activation by eliminating improvisation, and survivability assessments remained central, with dispersal of vessels across maritime spaces, ensuring that no single strike could neutralize an entire brigade-equivalent capability, and contingency planning included alternate offload ports and rerouting protocols to preserve deployment tempo, even if primary facilities were denied. And in aggregate, these refinements meant that before the formal MPSRON structure was fully codified, the conceptual architecture of maritime prepositioning had already altered the strategic timeline equation of the Cold War, shifting heavy force projection from a slow-building reinforcement process to a rapid response mechanism capable of compressing crisis reaction into a window narrow enough to influence escalation dynamics in distant theaters. As the Cold War entered its final phase, the cumulative impact of maritime prepositioning on strategic planning was evident not only in logistics manuals, but in the structure of joint contingency frameworks, because the availability of afloat equipment sets enabled planners to design response options that were previously impractical under traditional sealift timelines, allowing for rapid, scalable insertion of brigade-level combat power without waiting for full transoceanic reinforcement. And this flexibility influenced how geographic combatant commanders assessed deterrence posture in regions such as the Mediterranean and Southwest Asia, where permanent heavy basing remained politically constrained and deployment modeling incorporated. Defined readiness milestones tied to pre-positioned ship activation, such as days from notification to personnel airlift completion, hours from ship arrival at designated port to commencement of selective offload, and days from initial discharge to establishment of operational command and support infrastructure ashore. And these metrics were rehearsed in joint exercises that validated synchronization between air mobility, sea lift command, port authorities, and supported ground forces, confirming that the principal variable had shifted from ocean transit duration to coordination efficiency at reception nodes. And sustainment doctrine ensured that afloat equipment sets contained not only maneuver platforms, but sufficient supply stocks to sustain operations until follow-on logistics arrived, preventing the compressed initial deployment from creating sustainment gaps, and institutional reporting systems tracked vessel readiness status, maintenance cycles, and cargo integrity to preserve confidence in rapid activation capability, and by integrating maritime prepositioning into force planning documents and budget priorities, the Department of Defense effectively embedded forward afloat storage as a standing component of Cold War deployment architecture, ensuring that before formal squadron structures were fully consolidated, the strategic effect had already been achieved. Heavy equipment no longer needed to begin its journey at the moment of crisis, because it was already positioned within operational reach, transforming deployment timelines and reinforcing the credibility of rapid U.S. force projection during the concluding decade of superpower rivalry. In its fully matured pre-formalization state, maritime prepositioning had already reshaped the structural mathematics of Cold War deployment by redefining where time was consumed in the projection of heavy combat power, because for decades the dominant constraint had been the ocean itself, with sea lift transit from continental embarkation ports forming the largest block in reinforcement timelines. Yet by relocating equipment sets forward afloat during peacetime, planners effectively erased that transit interval from the initial response phase, substituting synchronization and offload efficiency as the new pacing variables. And this shift reverberated through time-phased force deployment data, wargaming scenarios, and deterrence assessments, as brigade-level combat capability could now be plotted on readiness curves measured in days rather than weeks, enabling graduated response options calibrated to compressed warning assumptions and regional escalation patterns and the evolution of vessel configuration, cargo sequencing, maintenance doctrine, and geographic dispersal ensured that these ships were not static depots, but operationally viable platforms capable of sustained readiness under maritime conditions, while integration with airlift doctrine guaranteed that personnel movement could align precisely with equipment availability, minimizing idle time between arrival and combat configuration. And although the formal maritime prepositioning ship squadron structure would later codify this architecture, the decisive transformation had already occurred during the preceding decade of conceptual refinement, engineering adaptation, and joint rehearsal, as U.S. force projection doctrine internalized the principle that prepositioned maritime storage could compress deployment timelines sufficiently to alter adversary calculations and expand strategic flexibility, marking one of the most consequential logistical innovations of the late Cold War, by converting the ocean from a delay factor into a forward-staged deployment platform embedded within global response planning.